Welcome, everyone. I'm Yael Aronoff, the director of the Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel. We're also honored to have so many students here and faculty, and also Michael Elaine Serling, who really made it possible for us to have Amy's position as chair of Holocaust Studies and European Jewish Studies here at MSU. So welcome to everyone. Before we get started and before I introduce Amy, I just wanted to tell you about a few upcoming events that we're having. So our next event is right after spring break on March 4th, and we're having kind of a relatively famous screenwriter, writer Noah Yedlin come. She has a very famous kind of TV series as well called Stockholm, so we have flyers in the back in case you're interested in that. We also, and Professor Simon organized and helped organize this, I think with Professor Pauly maybe as well. There's going to be a lecture on the Holocaust and the exile of Yiddish by Barry Trachtenberg, and that's on Tuesday, March 12th here in the Madison Library. And then later in March, we're having a two-day symposium on March 18th and 19th to celebrate another book of one of our faculty, Professor Vered Weiss, who's here. It's going to be on Israeli culture and emergency routine, normalizing stress, personal and academic perspectives. And I think one of those might be in Madison, but the flyers are in the back, and you can take a look at that. So before we get started, before you leave today, please grab one of our flyers, and I think we have things on scholarships for students. And we also have a sheet so that if you'd like, many of you are here from Professor Simon's class and some from other classes. That class counts towards the Jewish Studies minor. If you'd like to learn more about the Jewish Studies minor, just sign up that you're interested, and you can make an appointment with me. We can talk about it, and it's something for you to think about. Or if you're anyone else, a student, faculty, and staff, and would like to be on our email list so you get notified about all our events that we have practically every week or every other week throughout the year, films and lectures, and you're interested in more Holocaust-related things, we're going to have an annual Holocaust lecture that Professor Simon organized in mid-April, I forget the date. And then you'll get notified about those events. So before I get started, so I don't forget, we have lots of support for Professor Simon's lecture today from James Madison College, the College of Arts and Letters, the College of Social Science, the International Studies Program, the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion. So lots of support across the university, which we're thrilled with. So now I get the pleasure of introducing my colleague and friend, Professor Simon. You all know, many of you students, she's an amazing professor, right? Which is one reason she won the MSU Teacher Scholar Award last year that I like to always celebrate and tout. But she's done amazing research. I brought my copy of her book. She brought her copy. But it's Emotions in Yiddish Ghetto Diaries, Encountering Persecutors and Questioning Humanity. And obviously that's what she'll be discussing today. But it's a really groundbreaking work from literature and diaries. She analyzed a lot of it in Yiddish from different ghettos and really looks at, before the Holocaust, the traumas that people in the ghettos underwent, how they felt, how they were talking about it, and it really complicates who they saw as their daily persecutors and kind of pushes us in new directions in terms of how we can think about that. And I've already, we know about Holocaust studies scholars in the various universities who have already had lots of great reviews of this book. So we're really excited by that. And she's also published in journals and about teaching Holocaust studies and using diaries in Holocaust studies teaching that are also affecting how others across the country are teaching the Holocaust. So it's really our honor to have you, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you, Yael. I have my microphone. Yes. Okay. Don't forget your book. I know I had mine in. No, they look the same, but hers has an inscription. So thank you all. I just have to find a place so that I'm not blinded. It's probably going to be over here, also so I can access the slides. But thank you so much for coming. It really is. It's like I'm nervous, and I don't know why, because this is the friendliest audience, just a lovely, lovely audience of colleagues and students and supporters. And so thank you all for being here. I'm excited to talk about my book. It came out in June, and I thought I would do all these book talks and things, and things have happened, including October 7th, and other things have taken priority, and so I'm pleased to be able to do this, and I hope I can do some more in the coming months as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research process, and then I'm going to talk about what I found in doing my research, because, and this is great that so many of my 202 students are here. I teach a freshman seminar in James Madison College, MC 202, which is, I forget what they call it, but it's about researching and conducting academic research as part of like a first year program of learning writing and research skills. So, that works out really well because I'm trying to help them, shepherd them through the research project as well. So the book, as you can see, is called Emotions, and each one of these words is really important. And it was really hard to figure out what to call the book. And then it has been through so many iterations. So each word is important, and I'm kind of going to take my cues from the title and how I organize the talk. So emotions in Yiddish, Ghetto, Diaries, and then every good academic book has a colon, encountering persecutors and questioning humanity. And so it's all of these things. Yiddish, emotions, Yiddish, ghettos, which are alone, kind of unusual things, perhaps, to focus on in Holocaust studies, and then encountering persecutors and questioning humanity. Certainly, the encountering persecutors is also very unusual in Holocaust studies. So let's get into some of this. So the first question I had as a very young and naive graduate student thinking, oh yeah, I'll write a PhD dissertation, and having no idea what that entailed, was how did victims think about their perpetrators? And this came from kind of, having read a lot about the Holocaust through undergraduate and my master's program, and then finding myself with a few years of coursework in graduate school and saying, what is something I don't know about, and how can I get at it, and why is it missing? And so I was curious because there's been a ton of research about the Holocaust and about ghettos in particular. And I knew I was interested in ghettos from the start because they are this kind of moment of a life that's been, cut off, right? That the ghettos I look at are literally walled off from the rest of the world, isolated, but it's still a life. Whereas, yes, there were ways of creating lives and things like that in concentration camps, but the world gets much, much smaller. The personal, private world gets much, much smaller in the concentration camps. And the ghettos, therefore, are this moment where people are undergoing intense persecution. They are literally walled off from everybody else, the Jewish populations, and they also live there for years. And so, like, what do you do as you're living in a place like that for years with, food restricted and medicine restricted and jobs restricted, I mean, everything restricted? How does that function? So the ghettos are this really rich place for thinking about how did people who still had kind of some freedom and privacy deal with their situation. So the ghettos, and then how did they perceive perpetrators? And again, this came from not a wish to understand perpetrators. And this has been a tension throughout my work, that I've had when you write a book, all these people have all these ideas. You have a dissertation advisor, you have other committee members, you have peer reviewers, you have all these people saying, well, what about this and what about that? And I got a lot of pressure to kind of focus on perpetrators. What do we learn about perpetrators from this work? And I was always kind of pushing back. Like, I don't care about perpetrators in this work. What I care about is, what are the victims thinking, feeling, how are they reacting? And what kept coming back to me was that perpetrators and victims and bystanders and every single one of these people, they were all people, right? They were all humans. Even Hitler was, in fact, a human being, right? And once we forget that, then it's not even worth talking about the Holocaust. And so I thought, these were people interacting with other people. Yes, these people had enormous power, and they did horrible things, and, this was not like an equal personable relationship that victims could have with perpetrators, but what was it actually? What did they think about this? And as far as I can tell, there's still nothing, or very, very little, and certainly no full-length, like book-length works, monographs for my 202 students that deal with this question of victim conceptions, perceptions, reactions to perpetrators. And so I thought, okay, that's really important because here is a human element that people haven't looked at yet. So there's a lot there, right? So you start with this big question and then all these other questions came up, right? So what kind of sources can I use? Turns out that in the ghettos, people were writing a lot. Right? And we've talked about this in my history classes, right? There wasn't TV, radios were illegal and so difficult to come by. There wasn't obviously internet, social media. There weren't places for people to write about what they were seeing or experiencing or experiencing it really except through like word of mouth, which we cannot recapture what was actually said in the ghetto, and through writing diaries and letters and poems and stories, and then other forms of writing like programs from cultural events and musical scores and newspapers, right? Underground illegal Jewish newspapers, official newspapers from the Nazi authorities, all these kinds of writings. And so I thought, okay, what am I going to look at? And I was already fascinated with diaries. As an undergraduate, I had become kind of immersed in the world of Etty Hillesum, who was a woman living in the Netherlands who wrote a diary. And I feel like I look back at my life and all these things were there, and then somehow they all magically coalesced. So I knew I was interested in diaries, but more than just being interested, I saw these as a way to get at something more of the personal perceptions than necessarily like a newspaper, right? That's not going to necessarily tell you what an individual is thinking and feeling. It's going to tell you what they decided to write about for public consumption at that place and time. And the diaries, although not perfect, and I mean, you can read a whole introduction explaining the problems with diaries as historical sources, I still argue really capture better than any other written source we have, kind of immediate reactions and serve as a place where many people did write kind of more openly about emotions and feelings and kind of personal perceptions than they might have in other forms of public writing. So I was interested in diaries. And the next question that comes up all the time is, well, why is it important to know what they thought about their perpetrators? Like, so what if anybody cares what they thought about their perpetrators? And as I already mentioned, to me this was super important because it was about this human interaction and getting at the core of humanity. And this, I mean, as it says in the title, encountering persecutors and questioning humanity. It turned out that this kind of perception of perpetrators was in fact central to people's conceptions of identity, right? It's easy to be human and have faith in the world and confidence and go about your business when everybody's being relatively friendly, life is going on easily. But in the case of something like the Holocaust and something like the ghettos, where the circumstances are horrific, it's human beings who have created the horrific circumstances, and then within the ghettos themselves, they develop all kinds of weird hierarchies and relationships and difficulties. That's when we can start to see some of kind of pushing the limits, right? The limits of humanity and what happens when people are in the middle of a circumstance like that. Okay, why has nobody written about it before? I don't know why, because I still think, I mean, I wrote the book, I think it's really important, but I will say I got pushback from people, for example, who said, as I was telling them what I wanted to study, they said, well, no, they didn't write about the Nazis, so what are you going to write? I thought, okay, and I didn't know as early in my career or early in my research, so I didn't have an answer, but what I found out very, very quickly, and I wish I could pinpoint, right, the moment where I was like, aha, now I understand, but what I found out very quickly is that perpetrator isn't necessarily always a Nazi, right? And so this began a whole process of me figuring out, well, what is a perpetrator? So in Holocaust studies, since the 90s, there's been kind of a general categorization that people use to think about people and their behaviors, their actions during the Holocaust. Victim, perpetrator, bystander, right? So if we're talking about Jews in this case, because we're talking about the ghettos, Jewish victims, perpetrators, Nazis, and bystanders, kind of the other people that were just around. They didn't kill anybody, but they also didn't resist, and they weren't Jewish. They were just kind of around. And it's been complicated for many years, especially with the term collaborator, right, which can mean a whole lot of things. Somebody that worked with the Nazis for a million different reasons, you know, whether in a national context or personally, those could be anybody, right? Those could be, you know, local Poles, Lithuanians. They could be, you know, anybody who's not a Nazi, but who was, you know, somehow under the Nazi regime, which was, you know, the entirety of Europe. But more than that, it turned out, and I really had to come about this methodology, that what I realized what I was looking for was not, okay, when are they writing about Nazis and what do they have to say? What I was finding out was that when I was reading, and if I read empathetically, which is one of my, I'll go back, which is one of my methodological prongs. If I read empathetically, listening to what they said and trying to understand what was going on, instead of saying, who are the victims? Who are the perpetrators? Who are the bystanders? Instead of, I said, let's get rid of categories and let's just see what they say, I found all kinds of moments at which they were expressing their suffering and their all kinds of emotions about their suffering, and it had nothing to do with Nazis. And sometimes it had to do with Nazis, of course, but it also had to do with Poles and Lithuanians and Ukrainians and a whole host of Jewish people in the ghettos who, and I'll give you kind of my rundown, who participated in ghetto life in ways that were harmful to other people in the ghetto. So in my work, I am not trying to say that Jews are perpetrators. And in fact, I got rid of a lot of the uses of the term perpetrator in my book, even though that was central at the start, in favor of the term persecutor, in order to kind of capture the experiences, the felt experiences that people had, rather than trying to categorize people this way, that way, and the other way. Turns out it was much more complicated, much more messy, and sometimes people could be all of those things. I mean, Polish, you know, civilians were a great example. They were absolutely victims of the Nazis. No question. They were killed en masse. They were, you know, things were stolen from them. They were sent to forced labor. They were not doing well under the Nazi regime. They didn't want them there. It was, you know, they were under occupation. They also often helped out, collaborated. They could be the ones on the ground telling the Nazis, here's where the Jews are. You know, oh, you don't know because you don't live here, but I know. Here are the Jews, turning them in. You know, participating, one of the categories I'll show you is guarding at the ghetto gates, right? Making sure the Jews stay there. You know, participating as police forces, you know, patrolling and making sure that Jews don't escape. All kinds of things. Also stealing, right? Like, oh, your neighbor got deported. Well, that's a great opportunity to take over their house or their stuff. So there's all kinds of ways. And then bystander. Obviously, there's some kind of bystander. I also argue bystander is a useless construct. It doesn't mean it. Everybody did something, right? Except for maybe like a 6-year-old, you know. But like adult thinking human beings, mostly, at least based on what these diarists said, did something. So bystander. So you could be all of those things all at the same time. And that's what I found in looking at emotions. So when are they expressing their suffering? When are they angry? When are they afraid? When are they scared? What's happening and who's involved? And then, again, empathetically reading. And that came really late. That came after my first round of peer review, because the book was published by a scholar, psychologist, and historian at Williams College, Thomas Kohut, who wrote a book about empathy and historical understanding. And it was like all the light bulbs came out. So maybe a good reason that it took me so long to publish the book, that I got like a published explanation of what I had been doing for a long time. All right, so the questions then I had to narrow down. There are 1,100 ghettos in occupied Europe, hundreds of them in Poland. Couldn't look at all of them, right? So I had to start narrowing down. I had to know, if I'm looking at diaries, what is a diary anyway? we all have like a understanding that it's, you know, something you write down. It's a personal thing that you write kind of daily or regularly. But in the archives, in the Holocaust archives, there's all kinds of stuff that falls under a kind of listing of diary. It can be daily diaries, like entries that are written in hiding, like outside of the ghetto. Diary, but not really talking about the daily life in the ghetto that I was looking for. A lot of the things labeled as diary are actually memoirs. That was the biggest thing, and I kept reading, and I'm like, oh no, this is saying using the past tense, like this is clearly not written at the time. So I was really interested in preserving the genre of diary as being daily. Whatever, after that I didn't really care, but being daily, because I wanted to see change over time. And that becomes an important part of the book too. How do things shift? And then finally, language, right? The book is called Yiddish, Emotions in Yiddish Ghetto Diaries. Part of this is practical. I learned Yiddish. Yiddish is my research language. I do not have all of the languages, and I do, most notably, I don't have Polish. Man, I tried. Polish is really hard. If you've never learned, I've learned Spanish, I've learned German, I've learned Yiddish, but Polish got me. Maybe it came too late. But so aside from the practicality of being able to access Yiddish, Yiddish was the mother tongue of the vast, I don't know, 95% of Polish Jews at the time. Even if they spoke other languages, which many did, almost all, probably spoke some amount of Polish, perhaps Ukrainian, a little bit of Lithuanian if you were in Lithuania, maybe Russian, maybe German, definitely some amount of Hebrew, whether fluent or not. And so there were a lot of language choices that people had, but Yiddish was the folk language. It was kind of the language of the people. And from the early 1900s, there had even been kind of intellectual movements headed by YIVO, which is the Yiddish Scientific Institute, started in Vilna and then moved to New York in the 20s, that focus around Yiddish and researching the Jewish people through Yiddish, as that's an essential core of Jewishness. It was a political movement, a Yiddish political movement. It was an intellectual movement. It was a literary movement. So the choice of Yiddish means something in the ways that it was an identity marker for Jews in Poland. And if they chose to write in Yiddish, either they had no choice, so that was just they were the people, I guess, as the intellectuals would describe it, or they chose Yiddish, and when they did, they were clearly seeking a Jewish audience, right? Nobody else is going to read Yiddish except for Jews. So it tells us something about the mindset of what they thought they were doing with their diary projects, either for themselves or, as we'll talk about, sometimes very obviously written for other people. All right, so here we have a map that just shows like a very small number of the ghettos in occupied Eastern Europe. And so the ones that I decided to look at are Warsaw, Lodz, and Vilna. You can see Vilna is in, it says occupied Eastern territories, the area that when the war started in 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union came up with a non-aggression pact. So Germany said, I'm going to attack Poland. You can have half of Poland, and we won't attack each other, right? We'll remain peaceful. You can have one half of Poland, we'll take the other half of Poland. Soviet Union agreed, and so it's kind of, this is not the map. I have those maps too. It's kind of around here that the line was where the Soviet Union took over areas to the east and Germany took over areas to the west. So Vilna was in the east, and Warsaw and Lodz were in the west. So they were immediately occupied by the Nazis, and Vilna faced occupation 2 years later when Germany decided to attack the Soviet Union. So they all become places of occupation and ghettoization at different times. I decided to look at these three places. Again, it's very practical. I actually spent months and months trying to hunt down every last Yiddish diary that existed. And there are some from this place and that place and the other. But there are a lot more from Warsaw, Lodz, and Vilna. Warsaw was the largest Jewish population in Europe, but also then the largest ghetto. Lodz was second with about 200,000. Warsaw was about 400,000, 450. Lodz was about 200, and Vilna it was smaller, but a very, very important site of Jewish history, Jewish learning, and known as the Jerusalem of the North. So a very important place. So part of it was practical, that's where most of the diaries I found were from. But also there were all these linkages amongst the places in that, especially YIVO, this Yiddish Cultural Institute, had outposts in it was started in Vilna, and it had these outposts in Warsaw and Lodz, and a lot of the people there knew each other or knew of each other, even though they were in different places. And so it's part of the kind of ways that the relationships, you can kind of see the way they appear in the book. All right, so I went to lots of archives, but mainly the Holocaust Museum in DC, because they've done an awesome job of actually gaining access to copies of archives in all these other places in the world. They have a lot of resources. I also spent time at the YIVO Institute, like I said, the scientific institute that started in Vilna in the 20s, then moved to New York later in the 20s, and still exists in New York. So that was exceptionally cool from a historical perspective, but also not super helpful because the archivists there were not helpful. Yad Vashem, which is the Jewish Archival Institute and Museum in Israel, the Ghetto Fighters House, which was a very early kind of museum and archive created to commemorate the resistance fighters in Israel after the Holocaust, and then the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. So these were the main archives I needed that I realized through scouring all the archives, finding aids and things, that's where the diaries would be. What I found was about 30 to 40 Yiddish diaries from these 3 ghettos that survived. And so that became the basis for the book. Some were very short, right? Missing most of it because you have to remember, and this is why I have pictures, these are all pages from Ringelblum's diary, and I'll explain who Ringelblum is in a minute. They were in various states of disrepair. Not all of them were rescued. And so, yeah, even people whose diaries had been rescued, maybe only 2 pages. Sometimes people were lucky and much more was rescued. I'm going to give you 2 rescue stories, but there are a lot. And the rescue stories alone are quite phenomenal stories. All of the diarists that I wrote about, with the exception of 2, did not survive the Holocaust. So this is what we have, right? We have what they wrote at the time if we want to understand their experiences. So what? Again, what does it matter that I'm looking at these perpetrators and the ways that Jewish diarists were writing about them? And again, it implicates in these diaries so many more people than just Nazis. And so I started out with description. What did they have to say? And then what did it mean? So I already talked about emotions and empathy. So the 2 case studies. And the reason I'll focus on these guys is that, first of all, they were really important cultural leaders in their respective ghettos, but also because they, in one of my chapters, the one that's about evaluation and judgment, I use them as case studies. Both of their diaries are super long. They follow several years of ghetto life. They have survived largely intact, although not entirely. They've also been published in many languages, including Yiddish and English, so I could kind of triangulate. I'm going to be honest, I couldn't read Ringelblum's diary, the handwriting. I found it very difficult. I had to rely on the published Yiddish in conjunction with the translations. The translation was not of the published, the translation was of the original, so I did a lot of triangulation. And the Herman Crook is the second case study. He's the one that I couldn't get access to at YIVO, even though most of his diary existed there, but also had been published in Yiddish and in translation, so I was able to kind of do my best. I was able to get parts of the Crook diary, so some of that I was able to look at the original, but not all of it. So, Emanuel Ringelblum. Herman Crook, excuse me. So Herman Crook was born in 1897. And he, at the start of the war, he was a Jewish intellectual. He was a journalist in Warsaw. And at the start of the war in Warsaw, he fled east, like very many did. It was something like 2,500 refugees from Poland made their way to the eastern, Soviet-occupied zone. Into Vilna itself, at the start of the war, because it was known, or it was guessed, it was assumed that men would be conscripted conscripted for labor, for military service, and so many of the leading intellectuals who were men left, and then women and children largely stayed behind. So Kruk left, he made his way to Vilna, and he became the librarian of the Vilna Ghetto. And he lived there until 1944. So again, the war starts in Vilna in the summer of 1941, and the ghetto comes pretty quick. So it's about 3 years that he lived in the ghetto, and we have a diary from almost that entire period. And so Herman Kruk also is an unusual fellow because he had a library. He was part of a kind of unofficial archival project within the ghetto of different intellectuals who were collecting materials, including diaries, in many languages, actually. The other people in his group wrote in Hebrew, in fact, but he wrote in Yiddish. And he very clearly, I mean, a different talk that I give is about diaries in general, Holocaust diaries. And one of the things that I talk about is, why did people write these diaries, right? And for Kruk, it was very clear, and he says it right after the occupation or the invasion of Nazi Germany of Lithuania on July 23rd. So the 24th is when Vilna became occupied by the Nazis. But on the 23rd, he had already been writing, so he knew he was living in unusual times. He had written retrospectively about his attempt to flee east and all of that. But on the 23rd, he says, quote, "I make a firm decision. I leave myself to the mercy of God. I'm staying." So he had a choice to leave. It's a whole story, but he had a chance to leave. But he says, "I'm staying. And right away, I make another decision. If I'm staying anyway, and if I'm going to be a victim of fascism, I shall take pen in hand and write a chronicle of a city. My chronicle must see, must hear, and must become the mirror and the conscience of the great catastrophe and of the hard times. I have decided to write a chronicle of the events of Vilna." So we know that he was very dedicated, and he wrote almost every day. And he wrote about everything. He wrote about personal things that were happening to him. He was also writing, he was interviewing people that had different experiences. And Vilna was different from Warsaw and Łódź in that when the Nazis came in, instead of putting everybody in a ghetto right away, they shot everybody right away. So there was a forest outside of the city called Ponari, and basically the Nazis just began rounding people up and bringing them out there. In the first, June, July, August, September, 6 months of the war, they murdered about 70,000 people there. So only about 30,000 people, 70,000 Jews, and only about 30,000 remained to go into a ghetto to kind of continue living for several years like Kruk did. So they started with this trauma, and where was I going? And so he wrote, like, when a couple people survived and came back to tell the ghetto the story, and he wrote it down. He interviewed them, these young girls, and was able to write about it in his diary, which was a mix between, like I said, personal and kind of public, and keeping a chronicle of the city. So he did that through the entirety of the war, and then in 1944, in August, the Nazis finally decided to liquidate the ghetto, to end it, and to get rid of all the Jews. They killed a bunch, and they also sent people to labor camps. And so Kruk went to a labor camp in Estonia, and he worked hard labor there for a few months. And on the day before the Soviet Union was going to liberate the camp where he was, they could see the trucks, and it was very clear that the Soviets were right there. The Nazis decided to get rid of the remaining Jewish people there, lined everybody up to kill them, and Kruk stood with 6 of his friends, and he said, "I'm going to bury my diary. If I don't make it, if any of you should make it, please find it after the war." And one of his friends survived and was able to dig up the diary. So that's how we have the vast majority of Herman Kruk's diary. And like I said, it spans the whole, all the way into Estonia, he continued writing. And then the other case study I'm going to give you is Emanuel Ringelblum. And so Ringelblum was a historian. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise that he began a historical project in the Warsaw Ghetto. He called it the Oyneg Shabbos Archive, which means the Joy of Shabbat. as a code name, so the Nazis would have no idea that it was actually an underground archival project trying to record basically every aspect of life in the ghetto. So he and about 30 of people he knew worked together, collecting all kinds of documentation from within the archive. They did things like write diaries. He wrote a diary, which I've shown you some of, more like daily notes. His is actually very not personal. It's very much a chronicle, or more like notes that he thought he could use later to write a history. The secretary, Hirschwasser, the secretary of the group, also wrote a diary. One of the other major players, Rochel Auerbach, wrote a diary in Polish, even though she was an avowed Yiddishist. It remains quite a mystery. She herself, after the war, said she couldn't figure out why she did that. Anyway, and so they collected other things too, like reportage on different topics, children in the ghetto, hunger in the ghetto, women in the ghetto, and then they collected other stuff, right? Ephemera, the programs of of cultural events and tickets and money and the different decrees that came out and things like that. It's a major enterprise. Ringelblum himself, despite his collecting all of this history, as you see, did not survive. He and his family had gone into hiding after the Great Deportation of Jews. So basically in the summer of 1942, about 300 of the 400,000 Jewish people living in the ghetto were deported to Treblinka and killed. And Ringelblum and his family went into hiding. And then he was in and out of the ghetto, and then we know different things happened. So they buried the first kind of group of documents after that great kind of in the middle of that great deportation, because they figured, okay, if nobody survives, at least the document should survive. So they buried it, and like 3 people knew where it was. And then the following year, so there were some survivors, several, about 100,000 survivors. The following year, the Nazis decided to liquidate the ghetto again in January, and there were all these, there were a few underground fighting organizations in the Warsaw Ghetto, Jewish resistors, who fought back, and so things were not ended in January, but more documents were buried. And then finally in April of 43, the Nazis came in full force to liquidate the ghetto, and they ended up fighting for a month with the ghetto resistance groups. And at the end of it, of course, the ghetto resistance groups failed. They were overrun by the Nazis, and the whole ghetto was razed. People were smoked out of hiding places, and all of the buildings were burned down. So here we have a picture of the ghetto from May 43, so you can see like the buildings barely are standing. And then this is after more destruction in 45, basically right after the war, but a part of Warsaw where you can see that again, near in the vicinity of the ghetto, that you can see this church remained, but everything else had been destroyed. So there were 3 groups of documents that were buried. Ringelblum himself was in hiding and wrote the whole time he was in hiding with like 30 people in a cellar. And eventually the cellar was denounced, and he was brought to the ruins of the ghetto and killed, him and all of the people, including his wife and child, that had been there. So he did not survive, but we have his writings. And here is an example, some images of what they dug up after the war. So there were, like I said, 30 to 40 people there. There were 3 survivors. One of them was Hirschwasser, who's this guy, who was the secretary of the Oyneg Shabbos, and his wife, and Rochel Auerbach. Those were the only 3 people who survived that were part of this organization. And you see them, digging up some of the documents. They hid them in these tin cans and milk cans to try to preserve them with metal. But you saw, right, that was only mildly successful in that clearly, weather and fire and everything managed to destroy some, but not all of the documents. And you can see this one was dug up in September 46. So some time passed, right, from the end of the war until 46. And then more of it was dug up in 53, I think. So there was a fair amount of time, and one of the caches was never dug up. They never found it because it was hard to find when the whole city was destroyed. Like, where exactly did they bury these things? So it's still a mystery whether we might find some more. But in these was Ringelblum's diary amongst many, many thousands of other pages. All right, so findings or so what? I looked at all these diaries, I learned all these stories, I thought about emotions and empathy, and I realized some things that I didn't know before and that most people don't tend to think about when they think about the Holocaust. So the first kind of few slides are about encountering persecutors, right? I started with the question, what did they think about persecutors? And I ended up with the answer about questioning humanity. So encountering the persecutors, the first thing I had to know was what and who did diarists describe as the cause of their suffering, right? If we're saying persecutors and there's all this suffering, who did it and what did it consist of? And what I determined is that the suffering in the ghettos was not just about the final solution. It wasn't just like, oh, there's this Holocaust, they want to kill us all, and therefore we're suffering. And it wasn't just about, the lack of resources and the starvation and the lack of medical care. Yes, it was about all of those things. It wasn't even just about the physical violence. In fact, it was about these kind of mundane, daily, persistent, continual acts of persecution and the suffering that came with them that was just prevalent. Every single minute of every single day there was something. And in fact, the name of my dissertation, the title was from a quote from a different diarist who's a teenager in Vilna, called Surrounded by the Hunter on All Sides. That was my initial title, but then got into a thing about hunting and prey, and so I took it out, but I still kind of like it, at least rhetorically, because it captures what I think was the general experience that these diarists describe, which is like this suffocation of being hunted in every way, shape, or form. Every single minute was some kind of fight. Right? Is a fight for food, or is a fight for medicine, or is a fight to go to school, or is a fight to find a work, or is a fight, some kind of a fight just for daily survival. And so one of my chapters kind of thinks about then, if there's all these different kinds of suffering, that's not just, okay, they were sick and they died, or they were being killed, but rather these kind of mundane daily things, what were they? And so I come up with 8 kind of categories of different things that, again, I looked at when did they talk about their suffering and when were they the most emotional about it, right? When were they just really miserable, upset, scared, sad, panicked, anxious, and these are the groups that I came up with. So the first one is taking advantage, and this could be something as simple as, actually I'll give you a quote in a minute, somebody getting more money or more food than somebody else at somebody else's expense. It could be something, a good example is in the Warsaw Ghetto, there are these 2 guys named Cohn and Heller, and they were well known as like profiteers of the ghetto. They got wealthy on kind of collaborating with the Gestapo at different times and having these different business enterprises, but in a place where there's a zero sum, right? Either literally you're rich or you are going to die of hunger. Getting rich meant something different. I will say most of my diarists were socialists or communists. So this is very much a flavor of, wanting to push back against the wealthy, against the powerful. But it becomes this very different kind of discussion in the ghetto, like I said, where there's a zero sum and it's literally life and death. So taking advantage, persecuting administratively. And the other interesting thing about these categories is that almost all of them dealt with victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. So for example, persecuting administratively, that could be the Nazis. In Warsaw, in Łódź, Hans Bibov was the accountant who was in charge of the ghetto. He didn't go in there and kill people, but you know what? He got really rich. He got his wife some really nice jewelry. And in fact, he was prosecuted by the Nazis after the war for having gotten rich when he was supposed to be sending all of the wealth back to Germany. So persecuting administratively could be something like that. So he's in charge of the finances. He's the pencil pusher, creating or, contributing to the suffering of people in the ghetto or people in the Jewish councils, right? So each ghetto had a Jewish council that was appointed by the Nazis and, accountable to the Nazis, answerable to the Nazis, literally on pain of death. In Vilna, the first council was all killed and another council was constituted. So this was a very real threat. But they were responsible. There's a whole bureaucracy built up, especially these big ghettos like Warsaw and Łódź around the Jewish council. And they were responsible for housing, for example. So what does it mean when all of their friends and families get a nice apartment and, somebody else gets, 10 families in 2 rooms? So there's that kind of maybe administrative persecution. Outright robbing. This was also, people have written about this, but I think like general audiences don't always think of this, but this was a major, major part of the Holocaust. This was a major goal. Yes, they wanted, the Nazis were intent on killing Jews, but also of stealing every single thing they could get from them in the meantime. And this also, like I said, applied a lot to other people like Poles or Lithuanians who could stand to get rich off of the Jews. Guarding is a really important one because all of these 3 ghettos had these gates, and the gates were the site of an enormous amount of anxiety, pressure, and violence because the gates kept people in, and people are always trying to get out, to smuggle goods in and out, to get more food. In Warsaw, the vast majority of food that was in the ghetto came from smuggling. And so this was a very fraught situation. And then there were people that were going in and out legally for work. But it was tricky. And at the gate, or at the gate, at the walls, who was guarding them? Nazis, locals, so Poles or Lithuanians, and Jewish police. So this was literally the 3 groups working together, whether or not they wanted to, as in a way of persecuting the people who stuck inside. Obviously, and we move from like least to most violent in this, but beating, so, the kind of regular physical attacks happened, mostly carried out by Nazis, but sometimes Jewish police. And then rounding up and killing. And so obviously there was outright murder. We know that the rounding up often led to death camps, but they didn't necessarily know that at the time, at least not at the start. And so it wasn't clear, but everybody knew it was bad if they were being rounded up and sent away. In Vilna in particular, it was often for work, for forced labor, and it was so bad. It was so what's the word, like regular, the roundups in the first 6 months of the ghetto that almost every man who were the people being rounded up for work created something called a malina, a hiding place that they used to try to escape the roundups. And then, of course, rounding up. And who carried out the rounding up? Well, the Nazis, yes. Also and the killing, the Nazis, and in Lithuania, almost all of the killing was carried out by Lithuanians. And rounding up also carried out, there was like this special group of Lithuanians that did a lot of rounding up. And then, of course, the killing, and the rounding up also, and importantly, was accompanied by participation from the Jewish police. And this became the major turning point in all of my diaries where, certain things could be born and certain things couldn't. And having fellow Jews participate in literal roundups to, an unknown destination in which people found out later were death camps, that was too far. And it led to a break in people's conceptions of humanity in the world. So let's see. I think I already basically said this, that focusing on their emotional reactions to the suffering shows us that it wasn't just Nazis. In fact, that there were all of these people participating in all these various ways that people considered their perpetrators. And this is the point too. So not only, okay, these are the horrible things that were going on, but then the second part of the book is kind of, well, what does it mean, right? So what if people were pushing pencils and that's who the diarists were angry at? And I argue that it's all about the ways that they evaluated and judged people. And I also argue that this is an essential way that they were maintaining some element of their own humanity by caring enough to write about these things in their diaries and really approaching them in thoughtful ways. And I'll show you some examples. So this is an example of the thing about taking advantage, and this is from Rudashevsky, like I said, a teenager in the Vilna ghetto. He wrote, "There's so much injustice evident among us Jews in the ghetto, so much that is not right, so much that is disgusting. For instance, in the distribution of meat on the ration cards, those who have pull with the butcher get a somewhat fatter piece. Every so often, a policeman struts in, some well-known man, a genteel lady, a matron, people with briefcases. They turn to the supervisor of the store or directly to the butcher to take care of them. The butcher extends his sweet, wheedling face to them in such a disgusting manner, cuts out a piece of thick white fat for them. So you get a sense that, although this doesn't seem important in the grand scheme of the Holocaust, that this was one type of thing that happened regularly that, for Rudashevsky, he's very angry here. He's talking about being so disgusting, and the guy has this wheedling face that he's very clearly, he's in judgment of this butcher. The butcher was Jewish, and he was, just like Rudashevsky, except that he had this power, and he chose to favor these people that might help him at some point over somebody like Rudashevsky with no power. All right, so the questioning of humanity. So like I said, what they were doing when they were writing about these people was judging them, calling them disgusting, finding ways to separate the diarists separating themselves from these persecutors. So I argue that they were kind of trying to hold on to their own sense of morality by separating them out, that, not all of us are this, right? This whole community hasn't become destroyed. And in fact, these people are a particular group. And again, this also included Nazis, right? That Nazis, or Germany before Nazism, was seen as civilized, seen as educated, progressive, enlightened. And so people had to revise that idea, which they did, of course, in the diaries, but also, Poles, actually, in my 202. Some of you read the article about the newspaper article, actually, no, it was Sasha, read the article about the Polish identity and the ways that Polish identity, and Jewish identity were intertwined. And so, they had to revise that. And in fact, Ringelblum wrote a whole book in the Ghetto about the relationship between Poles and Jews during the Second World War. A book, a lot bigger than my book, in the middle of going through this and the kind of everyday persecutions. And then, of course, fellow Jews who came in for the most emotional discussion because they were, of course, the closest, and it was the most painful for people to see people within their own communities participating in these persecutions. So again, I have a chapter that kind of takes us through different ways that people wrote about perpetrators or persecutors, focusing on, again, these were all kind of othering techniques. So as criminals, beasts, inhuman, others, just kind of general language, die Macht, or andere, just kind of general terms to mean not us. And then finally things like lords and masters or fine fellows, often in quotes as an ironic kind of discussion of how horrifying these people actually are. They also used a lot of, not surprisingly, especially in the Yiddish, historical and religious references to try to understand what they were going through their Jewish, Yiddish reference points, which would have included religious enemies. And it's interesting because it's both historical and religious. I gave a few ones that people might know here, but there are a lot more, even different Russian figures and different literary figures and things that I had to look up because I was not familiar as a Jew living in the United States in the 21st century of what the reference was. But people like Haman from the story of Purim, Pharaoh, of course, the most famous persecutor of Jews in Jewish history, the Cantonist kidnappers. So this was in the 1800s in Russia. Jewish boys and men were conscripted to 25 years of military service, and the authorities tasked local Jewish groups with rounding them up. And they used the exact same word, chapuna or chaper, to talk about the people who were Jewish people and non-Jewish people, rounding people up in the ghettos, especially Vilna, that they used to talk about that historical event. So there are a lot of things going on where they're trying to make sense of what's going on, but also trying to push out people that are participating in these horrendous ways. Because again, basically, people, I would argue, and I have lots of quotes in the book, but a quote here that will hopefully demonstrate the ways that they were experiencing the Holocaust in the ghettos, not only as this persecution, a physical persecution on a regular basis, but also as an assault on their humanity, right? And so I argue that what they're doing in these diaries, in these discussions of perpetrators, is not just telling us what happened. Because they could say the Nazis killed 12 people today. And they do. They actually use passive voice a lot. 12 people were killed today, things like that. But they also, alongside that, spend time demonstrating their emotions and using kind of very descriptive language to talk about these people and judge them. So I have a quote from Ringelblum, who shows us an example of the inhuman, which was super common, and the wilde Chaya, the wild beast, and the Nazi beast. I have an article about that as well. But Ringelblum, during the Great Deportation, says that the Jewish police weren't content simply to overcome the resistance, but with the utmost severity punished the criminals who refused to go to their death voluntarily. Every Warsaw Jew, every woman and child, can cite thousands of cases of the inhuman cruelty and violence of the Jewish police. Those cases will never be forgotten by the survivors, and they must and shall be paid for. So again, this isn't like just the Jewish police did this, but he's painting them as inhuman, as cruel, and in fact, that after the war, there will be revenge for the actions of the Jewish police. And revenge is a whole other thing I would love to write about. I didn't really get to in the book, and a few people have, but it appears relatively frequently in the diaries as people, they have nothing else except for to, call for revenge. If they're not literally, and none of the people that I wrote about were involved in the armed uprisings, although they were in cahoots and in like similar social circles with people who were in the armed uprisings, but that was not their way. Their way was more through documentation, writing, and just trying to survive. So finally, I'm coming to the end. We do very much see this change over time, and this was a big process for me in writing the book, which is that I had been doing this work on victim perceptions of perpetrators and what does it mean and how are they evaluating them for a long time, starting with the dissertation. But I realized that the book, even though it's supposed to be about these people and their thoughts and their feelings, really it wasn't very personal, and it wasn't really, their voices weren't as strong as I wanted them to be. And so I had always thought that in the last chapter I would do something about that. And so I did. The last chapter is called The Deepening Darkness, and it presents kind of an emotional history, thinking about how the Yiddish-speaking community of Jews in these ghettos shifted or how their emotions shifted, not just in regard to perpetrators, but also in regard to questions of humanity over the course of the life of each of their ghettos. And so, of course, it's not a surprise to say that I believe that their belief in higher ideals like enlightenment, human progress started to diminish, especially after these great deportations in Lodz and Warsaw that both happened in the summer of '42, and in Vilna that happened in 1943, and especially with the participation of the Jewish police. Like I said, there's a major break in kind of any sense of A, that they might survive themselves, B, that there's going to be a kind of Jewish community that survives physically and or psychologically intact, and that the worry that they themselves might not survive physically or psychologically intact. They doubted whether they remained human. And my 202 students definitely know about this because we just finished reading Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz. Okay, so I argue that the fact that they worried about their own, and actually their community, some of them wrote about Jews as a community and kind of what the experience was, that the fact that they worried about Jews' emotional responses to the death and despair, especially things like, the numbing, right? Just stepping over the bodies, not paying attention, trying to get extra bread, even if it might hurt somebody else, all kinds of examples of ways that, of things that seemed less than human, and that's their emotional reactions had become what they didn't want them to be. So their responses to the death and despair and their worry about their own emotional responses demonstrates their attempts until the last to maintain their humanity, right? They are fighting, and they are fighting, and they are fighting. They are not willing to say, we don't care. They continue writing. I always imagine Ringelblum sitting in his cramped corner in this, in this underground bunker, writing and writing and writing until the last minute, and questioning humanity, evaluating people, judging them, and wanting to let us know what they thought and what they felt about what was happening. And so I'll end with this quote from them, and then I'll end with a quote from me. So this is a quote from Abraham Levin. It was actually like a eulogy that he was reading about somebody who had died before the ghetto, but he was in the ghetto. It's a little complicated, but Abraham Levin was an associate of Emanuel Ringelblum's. He worked in the Ringelblum archive, and he was a teacher. He was a high school teacher, a much beloved high school teacher. He and his family did not survive, but he wrote this, which I found just enormously powerful. We live in a prison. We have been degraded to the level of homeless and uncared for animals. When we look at the swollen, half-naked bodies of Jews lying in the streets, we feel as if we find ourselves at some subhuman level. Yet we wish to live on, to continue as free and creative men. This will be our test. If, under the thick layer of ashes, our life is not extinguished, this will prove a triumph of the human over the inhuman, and that our will to live is mightier than the will to destruction, that we are capable of overcoming all evil forces which attempt to engulf us. And so I conclude in my book, because it's so much easier, like I spent so much time writing it, and it sounds so pretty. I can't possibly repeat it. Based on all of these things that I've talked about, I conclude with, while physical survival was indeed beyond the grasp of the vast majority of ghetto diarists and ghetto inhabitants more generally, this book argues that the struggle to maintain the human spark in the face of every possible attempt at its destruction speaks to the enduring humanity of these individuals. They did not survive. They did not physically resist. They did not triumph. They suffered indignity. They witnessed every manner of atrocity, and they watched helplessly as friends and family members died horrible deaths. But they remained human. They wrote their stories and the stories of their communities, seeking agency in a world that tried desperately to destroy it. Their diaries were not meant to survive, as Nazi forces did everything in their power to obliterate them. Their words should never have been available for us to read, and though the miracle did not come for them in their lifetimes, their words have persevered. Through them, we can read the perceptions, evaluations, and feelings they recorded as they encountered the psychological struggle of their lives. To penetrate the possibilities of human behavior, the complexities of human morality, and the depths of human emotion. That they continued this effort until the moment of deportation or death demonstrates exactly the strength, intelligence, and moral probing that separates people from animals, that makes us human. Thank you. I will take questions. Ronan. Oh, sorry. Oh, not Ronan. Sorry.
So, during the lecture, you were talking about like the concept of revenge, and especially like against maybe the like the Jewish police that were enforcing Nazi policy within the ghettos. Was that revenge or justice like ever actualized on?
Yes. So, first of all, I will say, for those of you in my senior seminar, there was certainly revenge against Nazis when possible. In that, I'm thinking about liberation of concentration camps, and there are known examples of times when prisoners were given kind of free rein to attack Nazi guards who might still be around. I can't think of examples of necessarily revenge against Jewish, I'm going to say collaborators, but participants. But there was some form of justice. So even in the ghettos, and then in Europe after the war, and then again in Israel, there have been what are called honor courts. And so literal, processes, legal processes for putting so-called collaborators on trial. And this, I have several friends who write about this a lot in Israel because it became codified in Israeli law that, and it appeared people would see each other, right? Like after the war, if they had all ended up in Israel together and cases would be brought. but it wasn't, people didn't go to prison as a result. It was an honor court. So the idea was that they might be reprimanded or kind of isolated from the community. So not revenge like, we're going to come after you, but certainly some form of justice for people that, survived and could. And actually, there's a story. Nobody knows, or as far as I know, nobody knows if it's true, but the major leader of the Łódź ghetto was a guy named Chaim Rimkowski, and he was, by all accounts, just a megalomaniac. Like, he thought he could save people. I'm not going to say he was altogether wrong in his kind of conceptions, but he carried out things in ways that were really abhorrent to the people in the ghetto. And the story is that he went with the last transport to Auschwitz and that he was killed on the train by fellow Jews. I don't know. Either that or, as soon as he got there, just because he was older and everybody was being killed. But yeah. So revenge gets tamped down after the war. And this is a big thing too, at least public calls for revenge. And the most famous example of that is Elie Wiesel, who became the most famous Holocaust survivor, wrote the memoir Night. But before he wrote Night, he wrote a memoir called Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, which means And the World Was Silent, in which he calls, he's just completely angry at the Allies, about everybody in the Western world who did nothing, and calls for revenge. So, and then that gets all edited out of Night for like a Western reading audience. So yeah, there's a lot going on there with revenge. Ronan, do you have it? Here, I'll grab it.
Thank you, but if there are students who want to talk, they should come.
I haven't seen any hands, so I need to see hands.
What is this thing?
It's for the live stream.
Oh, okay. Like this? Simple, like a microphone? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Amy. I wanted to ask whether in your research on, you're thinking about emotions in the diaries. So, as you yourself indicated, some of these people were in ghettos for a while, and life in the ghettos also had a certain, it also changed, right? Sometimes things were worse, sometimes there was a minute of, normalcy, relative normalcy, whatever. So I know that in some ghettos you alluded several times to cultural events, maybe theater, shows, music, teaching. So I wonder whether you've encountered positive emotions in the diaries, such as, people talking about love to their whoever, family members, romantic love, I'm sure, or maybe laughter, funny moments, I don't know, other kinds of emotions. That's other than the loss and the tragedy and all that stuff. And also I wanted to say about Yiddish, one of my favorite things about Yiddish is that if you say the English word far-fetched, doesn't it sound like Yiddish? Say it. Far-fetched. Just saying.
Yes,
anyway,
it does.
Yeah.
That's that's such a good question. And so I've joined this working group. I'm supposed to have written an article already about emotions in Holocaust studies. So people are writing about different things, and this is one of the conversations we've been having is about positive emotions in the Holocaust and can you talk about it? And if you do, how do you frame it? Because it almost seems like taboo, but of course people are people, and if they were humans, then they were also experiencing positive emotions. And I started grappling with that as I was, in this conference room of other people, some of whom are writing about love as kind of the main positive emotion. You really don't see. I can't think of any instances of people talking about laughter or joy, but certainly love, because it did develop and continued and things like that. Although I am thinking that was a letter that we read in my 202 that was about kind of people relaxing on the balcony in the Warsaw Ghetto and playing cards. So again, they're not laughing and having an uproarious time, but they're finding ways of pleasantness in the ghetto. So yes, so those things are there. I will say my diarists don't tend to write about them as much, and I think maybe it's because they're mainly intellectuals, mainly with an eye to the future. So they're thinking about chronicling, even if they don't frame it that way, like Crook did, very clearly. So I think they're not writing that as much because it's not as important. But even the teenage diarists, they don't write about that much. The female teenage diarists do, much more. So there's a whole gender thing, which my book doesn't touch, because guess what? There's no surviving Yiddish diaries by women in any of these ghettos. There are some diaries, very few. There are some female diaries that survive in other languages. So we know. What? Yeah, not the ghetto. Right. I mean, and Frank was very safe compared to what we're talking about. But yeah, so there are some, maybe a handful of female diarists in those ghettos. Like, I did collect the numbers in order to at least try to get a sense, even though they're in different languages. But yeah, it's very much skewed. Again, most of them that survived through these collection projects, which were almost all men, because men were the intellectuals that were doing the collecting. So yeah, so it's a very skewed study, and I would love to be able to maybe individually do female, a comparison, because I can't, there aren't enough from each place to really put them all together. But so the emotions, yes, so there are some positive emotions. They are much overshadowed by the negative, and there are other people working on joy in other Holocaust contexts. Yeah.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having this discussion here about your book today. But my question relates to the topic of the reevaluation that you talked about of Jews and their relations to their non-Jewish neighbors. First off, you mentioned a book about that was written during. Do you happen to know the name of that book?
Yeah, I think it's called Polish-Jewish Relations in the Second World War.
I should have figured. It's a historical document.
It's Emanuel Ringelblum. I have a copy of the translated book in my office.
And when it comes to your reading of these diaries, was there a lot of talk about, for instance, where they talk about how they thought about this before the war, and then how that has changed because of what they've seen in the ghettos?
Absolutely. I mean, less in the diaries, because there were also other writings that were like very much focused on that as a topic, besides just Ringelblum's. But it comes out a lot, again, especially with Poland. And the Lithuanian example is really different, because the Jews in Lithuania were not integrated into Lithuanian society. In ways, it was very much a Polish-dominated society. It kept moving back and forth between Russia and Poland and Lithuania, and it was so they weren't speaking Lithuanian generally. Although the head of the ghetto, Jacob Gens, was in fact married to a non-Jewish Lithuanian woman and had been in the Lithuanian police, which is another part of the story, that often the leaders came from not the Yiddish folk, kind of traditional Yiddish folk in Warsaw and in Vilna, but. So there's not as much about that in Vilna. Really, the Lithuanians are pretty much described as really horrifying. And in fact, they stand in for the worst of the perpetrators, even more than the Nazis. But in Poland, it's so much more complicated, because a lot of people were completely integrated. They were secular, a lot of my diarists, but a lot of people in general. Starting in the 20s, kids were being educated mainly in Polish schools. So this was like a creeping acculturation anyway. And identity was very much based in Poland, and so they really had to grapple with how they felt, and they went up and down in their diaries and in other writings. Sometimes they're like, yes, the Poles will come and we will, fight together, and then other times, witnessing blackmailers and some of these horrifying examples of collaboration. They're just like, they're mortified at the betrayal of who they thought were their Polish neighbors and friends. So it's the gamut of experiences. Although there was less about Poles than I thought. I thought at the start there would be all this writing about Poles, but I think they're also, depending on the individuals, once the ghettos are closed, there's a lot more discussion of them before the ghettos are closed, because they're having interactions, they're moving, but once the ghettos are closed, it becomes a lot harder to have those relationships at all. Yeah.
This is kind of maybe a variation of Onen's question, but were there instances, not just speaking of kind of positive emotions, but also networks of people kind of cooperating together, especially perhaps, I don't know if some of them, have socialist or perspectives that they're kind of really cooperating together or trying to protect children together in those ways that you may have examples of. And then also another question, that sometimes comes up and kind of questioning humanity and so forth is, I don't know through your diaries to what extent you found, and I assumed that both were occurring, both kind of people having their faith strengthened in God and people who having their faith destroyed or weakened in God. And I maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. So the question about God is a tricky one because the people whose diaries we have, with the exception of one, were not religious at all. They were very secular. The exception is Shimon Huberband, who was a rabbi in the Warsaw Ghetto. His diaries, he does not demonstrate a loss of faith in God. Let's just put it that way. But he grapples very similarly with the questions that I'm looking at in terms of perpetrators and humanity and all of that. As we know, the Orthodox communities often were the first to be killed because they were so visible. And they were not the ones writing diary. I mean, this is a secular project, right? The diary writing, the introspection of diary writing. And so all of the diary, again, I mean, people might have been religious in that. Maybe they went to synagogue and they talk about Yom Kippur and they talk about celebrating Passover, but they don't really investigate so much their faith in these particular diaries. They do call on God in very angry ways, right? They're very accusatory. If they're accusing perpetrators, they're also accusing God, absolutely. And the first question was about
Networks for
Oh yeah, oh my gosh, so many networks. So for example, Emanuel Ringelblum, the first thing he did was, when Kristallnacht happened and all the Polish, national Polish Jews were sent out of Germany, he went and he was like part of this group that was aiding people who were, kind of stuck in no man's land. And he continued. He was the founder of the Alleinhilfe, so the Jewish self-help organization in the Warsaw Ghetto. And he worked with the Joint Distribution Committee before the war until, the war made that a lot harder. And he operated, not he alone, right, but as the kind of representative in my diaries, he and Rochel Auerbach operated the system of house committees to try to organize people to be able to deal with situations as they arose, as well as soup kitchens, right, for aid for people starving throughout the ghetto. And that's one example, right? In Crook, he had the library, and they were collecting arms. They were collecting for armed revolt, even though it never happened. They were collecting documents. They were trying to preserve, the David Fishman book smuggler's book. They were trying to preserve Jewish cultural and religious things. So there was an enormous amount, and my diarists were involved in these things, right, as kind of leaders, intellectuals, and again, not all of them. These are the famous ones that I have 300 pages of diaries for. There's Joe Schmo Baker, or not Joe Schmo, Leon Hurwitz, and, people that we don't know that much about, who wrote kind of more about, I went to work today and this is my relationship with the overseer, and, those kinds of less lofty but still important things. Aaron, yeah. Oh, Kirsten.
Hey, so I have I have a question, but one, I guess, to sort of back up on this and to think about sort of responsive, number one, it was a great talk. Thank you. It was awesome. It's really great. I'm wondering how much, because they're seeing this as documentation, whether they're writing names, because a lot of the stuff you've shown has been very sort of general and been about sort of imagery, but I'm wondering how much they are actually imagining these honor courts in the future, how much they are actually feeling it necessary to name names as a part of what they're doing.
They do name names. I can't tell you particularly about this envisioning, because they're not necessarily naming names in a context of saying, but they are sometimes, Israel first. And I mean, I can tell you the names of some of the Jewish perpetrators that come up over Conan Heller. So I don't know if they're thinking forward, but they're definitely naming names at the time. Actually, that just reminded me, they also did carry out, there was revenge. Occasionally, there were some, especially in Warsaw, and I can't remember if it happened, or I don't know of instances, whether it happened in Lodz or Vilna or not, but certainly in Warsaw, there were some Jewish leaders who were known collaborators. There was a group called the 13 that were known collaborators with the Gestapo, and some of the lead guy, Sherinsky, was they attempted to assassinate him. I think it failed. So there were, like, on very small scale, there were actual actions, but and so he's named. So there are people. Crook names a lot of people in particular, and he says nasty things about them. Yeah.
In the hopes of sort of historical documentation.
And also to, just to be able to say this is, right, call him out, right?
I have another question about post-war stuff, but I'm going to give to I'll ask you later.
So you mentioned that you did research on 3 different ghettos. I was wondering if there was a difference between any of the emotions or anything that they felt between those 3 ghettos. Was there different kinds of hope or different kinds of that type of thing?
I would say it wasn't so much different as it was, the timeline was different, right? So it depended on what was going on there. But in all of them, you see things like the Nazi beasts and this kind of othering and distancing from Nazis of all kinds, and then particular Nazis. In each one, there's like a few that are present very regularly that get a lot of attention. And you see the same kinds of, almost exactly the same kinds of discussions of betrayal, like for Jewish police in particular, that are taking part in various things. Like in Vilna, the Jewish police never round up Vilna Jews for deportation. That doesn't happen. But they go to Ashmiana, which is a few miles away, and they participate in rounding up Jews there. And everybody in the Vilna ghetto knows about it. And oh boy, do they have things to say. And it's just, they're so shocked and appalled and horrified. And it's like the language is, the blood is on our hands forever, and, these kinds of things. So I would say that there's not so much difference in quality as difference in timing, because they do ultimately experience very similar things, if with a slightly different context and a slightly different time. They all have Jewish councils that are, well, it's a variety. Rumkowski definitely gets the worst because he is seen as, like, there's a lot more hostility to the Jewish council in Łódź because of that figure. In Warsaw, the original Jewish council leader, Chernyankov, commits suicide before the Great Deportation because he's told that it's coming. So he doesn't get a lot, but there's a lot about just like the council in general. So that those conversations are still there, even if they're directed at slightly different people. So I'd say definitely more similar than different, although you can pull out. And like Lithuanians, they don't exist in Poland. And so the discussions are different, but still tainted with the, othering and kind of questioning humanity and similar kind of themes. Yeah, thank you.
So like you said, we recently just did some, I guess more in-depth research on several aspects of the Holocaust, and in particular, I studied the Warsaw Ghetto and kind of the life and conditions. And you mentioned that one factor of perpetration that you singled in on was the smuggling, and I guess it's just a curious question because I read that a lot, obviously like you said, I would say majority of people's food would basically come from smuggling just because the rations were you weren't able to survive on them. And I also read that there was a food shortage at the time, just in general in Poland. So I guess I'm just wondering where the smuggling was happening. Was it happening more outside coming in, or was this food just being held amongst the people who are more privileged, or was it a concern of pricing? I guess I was a little confused on that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, the question of smuggling is so fascinating because, yes, especially in Warsaw, Łódź, it was actually almost a non-issue because it was almost hermetically sealed. But in Warsaw, there were a lot of people going in and out for labor details and things like that. So it was all smuggling, right, outside in. There were all kinds of, especially children became involved in smuggling. There were holes in the walls, and they tried to, like every which way to try to sneak out and be able to sneak back in with stuff, especially food stuff. It was seen in different ways amongst the ghetto inhabitants, and they all write about it. Not just diarists, also there's reportage about it. A friend of mine wrote a book about criminality in the ghetto and like how smuggling was perceived. But it was complicated because there was an understanding that this was life-saving, and it was seen as like enormously heroic for people that literally risking their lives, and the food wasn't always just for them, right? If they could bring in a lot, it would be shared and sold because, right, also trying to get money to go out and buy more food. But also it was criminal, and it could lead to repercussions in the ghetto, right? If people were found, there could be reprisals against people in the ghetto. Certainly they would be killed. And in Warsaw, there became a mafia that controlled the smuggling. So it was one thing for people to like conceptualize a little kid who's like trying to help his family survive. Most people were like, yeah, that's very heroic. This like group of people that were taking advantage, that was seen less kindly, although there was still an understanding that, yeah, they're bringing in the food, and without it, we don't survive. But then there's distribution. Who gets the food? Mainly the wealthy, right? There were cafes, there were nice places in the Warsaw Ghetto that only a very small number of people could frequent, and then everybody else is dying. So yeah, it's a complicated and just like really fascinating thing to think about that economy of smuggling. Yeah.
Thanks, Amy. It was wonderful to hear you present the book, which I had the honor of reading. You actually outlined the different ghettos quite nicely in the book. So I guess my reaction in your response to this sort of a comparative question is that Vilna or Vilnius always had to be different, right? Because the timeline, as you pointed out, was so distinct. So Vilnius was in Polish hands until 1939, then it passes into briefly Soviet hands, then Lithuanian hands, then Soviet hands again, and then Germany invades in 1941. And so the killings happen at a later date, but through these successive occupation regimes, and Lithuanians are involved in anti-Jewish pogroms as the Soviets leave and the Germans arrive. So that must have conditions perceptions of Lithuanians. So I guess my question to a question is
Thank
this:
you for outlining that.
Is that did Jews in the Vilna ghetto have an awareness of what was going on in the general government, and that is in German-occupied Poland, and what was happening to Jews there between 1939 and 1941, and then these killings that occur immediately when the Germans invade in 1941 created a huge absence of former neighbors? How was that explicitly felt?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer to that about how that was explicitly felt in the ghetto, because as I'm thinking about it, we have many fewer diaries, first of all, from Vilna. But the ones that I have are really more concerned with discussing, they're discussing, like I said, like Crook is talking generally about things going on in the ghetto, but if he's talking, he doesn't talk a lot about personal things, and he doesn't really talk. I'm trying to think. Rudashevsky is just talking about his family and stuff. And a couple others are in weird circumstances and hiding and things like that. It's a good question. I haven't seen it in the diaries, this like more broad conception of the loss. They're horrified by the dailiness of the loss, but the kind of stepping back I haven't really seen. It's a good question. But definitely they know what's going on in in the general government in occupied Poland, which, it's hard to tell how much. I mean, they know that bad things are coming. But every city also doesn't think that they're necessarily going to be part of it, right? The idea that it's a total annihilation, even in 41, is not clear, right? Even for the Nazis, it's not completely outlined. So I wouldn't say that they know that, but they know ghettoization's coming. And you can see that very clearly in the ways they talk about ghettoization. That's, the beginning of chapter 5, I talk about moving in the ghetto. They are calling on the images, both medieval images, but also images of what they know happened in Warsaw in particular. So, and there's like intermittent postal service, right? There's sometimes the leaders of the ghettos can visit each other at different times. So there's like some small amount of official movement and information that gets around. But yeah, so they're aware for sure of ghettoization and what all the horror. That's why he says, like, I'm going to be the, whatever, chronicler of the great catastrophe. Yeah.
And just quickly, I know one of your major contributions is to blur the lines between all these categories that people used to accept. When we're talking about emotions, do we have any emotions left by those you identify as sometimes persecutors, Jewish persecutors of other Jews? Are there any?
I have one diary that is like an amazing document. It's written by Lazer Epstein, who was in the Vilna ghetto, who was like the head of sanitation, and he gets called out by Crook for being one of these nasty. I don't know. He's not very specific in why he calls him out, but he has privileges of travel, and he thinks that he's exploiting the privileges. But when you read Lazer Epstein's diary himself, what does he say? Oh, I'm trying so hard to, make this happen and make that happen, right? Cherniakow too, even though his diary's in Polish, in translation, he's being criticized by people in the ghetto. You didn't do this. And then in the diary, it's like, oh my God, I'm trying so hard. I'm meeting with the Nazis every day. How could I possibly do more? So the only example I can think of somebody, it's a famous example, who's like internalizes the kind of guilt or feeling of being a perpetrator is the Kalel Perechodnik, Am I a Murderer? He was, I forget what town, but he was a Jewish policeman outside of Warsaw. And he, of course, participates in the deportation of his family. And he writes this memoir after the war that's, completely, attacking himself for his behaviors. But it's rare. It's a much rarer thing. So yeah, most of them, I always talk about this too. There's a diary by David Sharakowiak, who's a teenager in the Łódź ghetto, who writes about, at the end, we've read several years of his diary, and he's not doing well. He's very ill. He's starving. His family has all died. And he has a chance to become a member of the Sonder, what do they call it?
The camp is the Sonderkommando, but that's the camp.
It's not the commando, it's the Sonderabteilung, so just like the special unit, and it's kind of like, they're like the strong men, right, that are kind of carrying out some of the nastier parts, like the law and order group in the Łódź ghetto, and he gets a chance to join it, and he wants to join it because he's starving to death, and he gets more food if he joins it. And he talks to his buddy because he's a communist, and the buddy's like, no, you can't join that group. What's the matter with you? And we don't know whether he joined or not because the diary ends. But, so that one to me is always really fascinating because he's been in the rest of his diary, he's also very critical of Rumkowski and the leadership and the this and the that. But when push comes to shove, if you need food and you're starving to death, maybe, and that's not, I don't investigate that, but I would argue that the people that, everybody else that I have, they don't even necessarily accept that. The other example I can think of is in the Łódź ghetto, Joseph Zelkovich writes. He's also an intellectual leader and whatever. He writes a diary and a lot of other stuff. And he is a little bit more, he's kind of like, I understand why the Jewish police are doing it, but also I judge them. Mm-hmm. A little bit of, understanding of why a reasonable human being might participate that way for getting the benefit of food and protection.
Great.
I'd say that's a minority opinion, though, in the diaries.
as your esteemed colleague, I'd say we're reaching 7 o'clock. So,
Excellent.
Is there a last question?
Any other questions?
No.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. Thanks for your questions.